Hello and welcome to our continuing series ahead of the Union budget. Even as the last few quarters have been marked by an economic slowdown, a standout and startling feature has been the rise in unemployment figures, a problem that's been bubbling for many quarters now for the Indian economic landscape and indeed for people stepping out to work. At one point, at the brink or the crux of the lockdown in April, we actually had a staggering 122 million people who were out of a job. That situation has recovered, but it hasn't recovered enough, clearly not in the informal economy. It looks like the finance minister is going to address jobs in her upcoming budget speech. She has made indications to that effect. But what kind of pragmatic steps can she take, and how deep does the jobs crisis run? Joining me to talk about that are people who have an eagle-eye view both of what's happening in the formal sector and what's happening in the informal sector, daily wage laborers who subsist on daily wages and on daily jobs. So let me introduce what is looking like a panel that's going to add a lot of insight to this subject. Manish Sabharwal, who's chairman and co-founder of Team Lease Services, Rosa Abram, who's research fellow at the Azim Premji University, Jyotsna Jha, who's director for the Center for Budget and Policy Studies, and Ashutosh Gupta, who's country manager India for LinkedIn. Welcome all of you to the show and thank you for joining in. Dr. Jha, if I may start with you, what I'd like to do first is a little bit of a jobs audit in terms of what we promised to do last year and how much ground we have managed to cover for ourselves. In the previous union budget, where interestingly the theme was also jobs and education and health, more than 2.62 lakh jobs were to be created between March 2019 and March 2021. A bulk of them were to come from policing, some amount from the defense ministry, the home ministry, etc. How much ground have we covered in terms of, the jobs that were intended to be promised or allocated so far? Dr. Jha, the question is for you. And you'll need to unmute yourself, please.
I'm sorry, Mitali, I couldn't hear your question. There was some technical problem. Yeah.
Okay. Let me repeat it.
Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, I wanted to do an audit of sorts with you, Dr. Jha, in terms of how much ground we've covered on the promises that were made on the jobs front last year in the union budget versus where we stand at today. I mean, the overall figure, including police, etc., other verticals, was that 2.62 lakh jobs will be created from that budget going into 2021. Where have we reached so far, you think?
Well, I think in any case, the way this year has been because of the COVID-19, the pandemic, it's not fair to expect whatever was predicted, whatever was planned for this year's budget would hold true. So that's a different point. So I think we need not examine this year's progress from the perspective of what was said in the last year's budget. We need to examine it from the perspective of how the responses happened to what we faced. So it's a shock. So so when we experience a shock, the assessment has to be based on how we responded to that and how are we going to respond to through the coming budget. And there, I think so far we have different state governments. It's not only the union government that has to respond. Different state governments has responded differently, and yet I would say, and they are still grappling with the whole issue. This year's budget is going to be the test how the job and the income losses are going to be recovered. But I think the more important thing is that it's not only the job loss. Much more than the job loss has been the income loss. So a large number of people who are, who have come back to employment are earning much less. And the impact on both the economy and the well-being is going to be severe. It's already severe, and it is both in the short and the long run. And therefore, we have to respond to that. That's a far more important issue now.
Okay, let me try and approach this another way then, Rosa, and let me reach out to you for that, which is to understand, as Dr. Jha said, what the here and now looks like in terms of the situation for jobs. The data that we frequently turn to is what is documented by CMI, which also pointed out that the situation was extremely grim in April. Then we saw a sharp recovery, but through September and going into December, what we've actually seen is that numbers are beginning to slip again and the unemployment rate is actually rising. What do you pick up from your studies and from the on-ground reports that you're getting?
So yeah, what we look at, and we've essentially looked at CMI because that's the only sort of large-scale nationally representative data that's available. What we find is just in terms of numbers, when we look at data in December, which is your pre-lockdown period, we look at what happened in April, which is in the heart of the lockdown, and then we looked at what happened in August because these are time points for which we have CMI data available. Now, if you look at between December and August, you would find that there's almost a recovery in the sense that 90% of men who were working in December have come back into work. So just pure employment status, they are back at work. And we find also that, for women, however, we do not find this kind of recovery. We find that about 60% of women who were working in December were not able to come back into work by August. So you have the sort of gender differential in terms of recovery. The other thing that we see is also not just that, well, men have come back into the workforce, and the unemployment rate, if you just compare pre-lockdown and post-lockdown, are almost the same now. But you find that there's huge transitions in the kind of work that people are engaged in. So most people who have moved into kind of informal work, largely self-employment, and alongside that, they've taken a huge income cut, as Professor Jha alluded to. So there's income loss ranging between 10% to 50% in the rate of growth, in the rate of loss of income, and also a huge sink employment that's taking place because most people can't afford to stay unemployed. There is no other social security benefits that they have. So recovery has meant that people have come back, but they've come back in sort of more precarious employment arrangements.
Hmm. Let me pivot from the informal to the formal space. Mr. Sabharwal, you and I have spoken through the course of the last few months on how trends were looking. As we step into next year and more importantly, the budget, how would you describe the situation in the formal workspace as also to buttress the point that's been made about falling incomes, which I think was reflected in an ILO report as well, where formal workers' wages had fallen close to 4%, which is higher, than many other developing countries. But what is it that you see going into 2021?
I mean, I'd be careful with a disease called presentism, right? Historians warn about this belief that today's circumstances are special, unique, or unprecedented, because what COVID has really exposed is the pre-existing conditions of the Indian economy. Our problem has never been jobs. It's always been wages, right? I mean, unemployment has been stuck between 5 and 9% since independence. So we can get excited between 5 going to 9 or 9 going to 5, but poverty is a bigger problem, right? So I like to make the case that, let's be careful with sort of thinking about, COVID as sort of climate change. It's a passing shower. But it just reminds us that our problem have always been wages. They haven't been jobs. And unemployment, I think, is the wrong metric. I'm not particularly enamored by the CMI data. I don't think it's fully representative. I don't think it's fully rigorous. But I would submit that labor market data also is a pre-existing condition of the Indian economy. We've debated that over the last 4 or 5 years. So I would just submit that in a year like this, there's a 3 lakh crore shortfall in GST, there's a 3 lakh crore shortfall in income tax, and there's probably 3 lakh crores of new bad loans in all scenarios. So I think if we can't, and the central budget is only 29 lakh crores. Actually, states have a 34 lakh crore budget now, which is more than the central government. So I think that the formal economy has come back in pockets, but the data is too noisy right now. I think we should be very careful with either pessimism or optimism. We don't have enough information about the labor market to conclude. But if you look at high frequency indicators, and they are again controversial, is that the recovery is happening. And there are things that the budget can do, but any expectations from the budget for money in a year like this would be quite sort of misplaced, if not sort of impossible.
Hmm. Dr. Cha, do you want to respond to that in terms of whether you think this is something we have seen before? I mean, double-digit unemployment figures, I beg your pardon, especially for the key category of the working youth. Gender, as Rosa pointed out, has been battered really hard. In fact, if you look at, amongst urban women, it's actually down 23%, the number of women coming back into the workforce. Is this a passing shower? Would you agree?
I would actually say that despite it's not about the proportion of the budget that is there in the entire economy. It's about what direction you give to through using your budget. So it's not about how much money public spending brings. It's also about how that money is being spent and what are you trying to push? What are you trying to enable? And there I would say the kind of things that we are seeing, it's not about unprecedented. It's about that even if it's precedented, what you are facing is actually something very serious. And serious, it's not only, again, because of the size, but it's happening to whom? It's happening to those who are already were living in a most precarious, as Rosa said. So that has become much worse. So in a very highly unequal, and not only economically, but also socially unequal society, when these things happen, then it has like inequalities within inequalities. And that's something we are seeing very clearly. See, data in terms of precision is yet to come, true. But data in terms of direction is very clear. And you can see it state after state, wherever you go to. Like I'm talking of also through our research, and it's like any kind of research that you do, when you are in the field, you sense what's happening. So what you can see that there has been severe economic loss, employment loss. Much worse is income loss. Much worse that is for women. Much worse for those who were already in precarious employment. And it's not about employment, it's the nature of employment also. Where is the social security? What you are saying is a flight from private schools out. So if you have to bring those kids back, if you have to bring those young women and men back in the fold of education, you have to invest in education. And it's again not about a old school socialist idea. It's very much an economically sound idea. Look at Europe. Europe has thrived because of investment in public. The capitalist Europe has thrived because of investment in public education and public health. And I think it's time to do that, not only because of the well-being effect, but also because of the employment effect. We just have completed a multiplier-based study, very, very difficult input-output model and social matrix. And we found that income multiplier of public spending on health and education is not as much as manufacturing, and fair enough. I mean, that's a known thing. But employment multiplier is very high. And that's where you know that if you are spending on these public money, if it's being spent on this, in the short run, it will create employment, and it will also give money in the hands of those who are spending. Usual, I mean, this is something that a large number of economists are talking about. And that way, it will also create demand for your goods. What we are finding that, even those things which are being produced, for example, we were in Chhattisgarh last week, mining, it hasn't suffered badly because of production loss, but it's suffering because of the demand loss. Power, it's suffering because of the loss in industrial demand. Domestic demand may have gone up. So, so you have to pay attention to that. So you have to see the entire circular flow of the economy, keep the well-being in mind, keep the employment in mind, and keep the section which is at the lowest end in mind to decide what you spend in your budgets.
Ashutosh, I turn to you, which is a small but important universe, because perhaps it reflects the best in terms of skills and also the youth category. What did you see happen through the course of these few months at LinkedIn? And I'd just like to sort of contextualize my question with some of our findings at the YouGov Mint and CPR Millennial Survey, where we found across 10,000 respondents that young workers were actually hit hardest by the spate of layoffs that occurred in the wake of the pandemic. What is it that you saw happen in terms of trends, particularly for the youth?
I think there are a couple of things which were very evident when we looked at the LinkedIn data. Starting April, first of all, online learning literally got a shot in the arm. And we have not seen such kind of numbers ever on the platform, right? So we measure that in terms of number of hours spent on LinkedIn Learning, and that has grown 3x since April to December, right? So that's a significant increase. And the most important thing is, in the recent survey, we do a workplace confidence index survey, so WCI. A lot of our professionals shared that, and 60% or 57% of them shared that they will continue learning at the same pace or increase the time spent on learning. So that's significant. So that's going into the next year. It's not a short-term blip. It's not a short-term trend. People have realized the value of learning. And that was the first trend we saw, very, very evident in April when we went into the lockdown. Number two is when we look at the future, along with Microsoft, we looked into our economic data, economic graph data, and that trend, and I've shied away from saying it's a crystal ball trend, like it will happen, but I feel more confident now in December that digitization has got a huge acceleration, a huge shot in the arm globally and even for Indian economy, right? We recently published a lot of early conversations with CHROs, with CEOs on the platform, and all of them were talking about digitization in their respective sectors, be it manufacturing, be it retail, of course, technology sector, right? So when in June, we launched a global skills initiative along with Microsoft and GitHub. We wanted to help the professional workforce reskill them on the digital skills, because digitization means there'll be a huge demand for digital skills. And that's something which we wanted the global workforce to get ready. Now, with the kind of numbers and all the panelists were sharing, right? Like there is a huge shock to the employment system, which happened in the April to June quarter. This is not something which will recover like in few months. This is a long-term work which we'll have to do together. But I think, digitization, demand for digital skills, this is definitely something which will have to come together as a country and make some progress. And I think infrastructure, I mean, there's so many dimensions for
Sure.
this. But to your question, coming back, online learning and digitization are definitely two things which I saw very, very clearly during the lockdown.
Mr. Sabharwal, the problem also with an economic slowdown in a country like India is that it doesn't affect everyone in the same way. So larger companies have shown that they are quite nimble. There's been quite a bit of cost cutting, as you can see on their bottom line and profits that they've reported, in terms of their quarterly numbers. Equally, though, there have been a large number of small businesses that have had to down their shutters. Again, for the larger companies, being nimble does mean that you have greater cost cutting by way of layoffs. If these two large chunks of employment seem, like they have a question mark on them, who does the onus fall on in terms of creating some kind of larger employment mechanism or larger employment playground?
So it's unclear to me that fiscal and monetary policy can do something in the short run, if that's what you're asking, right? We're already at 14% of GDP. I mean, I don't think we can be like Japan at 21% of GDP. And if fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then no country would be poor. And monetary policy, I'm on the RBI board, all we can do is offer regulatory forbearance, lower interest rates, and give banks liquidity, and that has been done. So I think the COVID just reminds us that per capita GDP matters more than GDP at an individual level. We're fifth in the world in GDP, we're 138th in per capita. And at a corporate level, it reminds us that we may have 63 million enterprises, but we only have 22,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So I think, again, I would just come back to, this is a pre-existing condition. Credit to GDP ratio is 50%. It should be 100%. So all I'm saying is that we need structural reform, financialization, urbanization, formalization, industrialization, and human capital. I have no disagreement with investing more in human capital. And I mean, we haven't been able to fix government schools, so it's okay to say, you don't fix leaky pipes by turning up the water pressure. So my submission is that the policy window, timing problem and solution coming together, as we've seen in labor reform or agricultural reform, or maybe even if you think about the new education policy as connected, I would submit that's what the budget can do. We don't have fiscal flexibility. We don't have monetary policy flexibility. So let's offer structural reform and recognize that finally the problem is the productivity of our firms, of our individuals, and of our regions. And so I would be careful with overly expecting this budget to sort of spend 34 lakh crores or 35 lakh crores and sort of borrow 6-7 lakh crores. The US's fiscal deficit this year is more than our GDP. Now, we can watch on that with envy, but I don't think a country like India could do that. So I would submit that there is pain in the short run. Some sacrifices have been made and are being made. Are they being made unequally? I mean, we can debate whether India needs 63 million enterprises. The US economy is 8 times our size and it only has 24 million enterprises. So yes, I agree that there is a problem in MSMEs, but most out of 63 million enterprises, probably 30-40% of them are not self-employment, they're self-exploitation. So we have to be careful on whether we want India to be less poor in the long run or whether we are in the ICU, and I should not talk about people losing weight or quitting smoking. I mean, we've been in the ICU for a long time, and my submission would be is that COVID has just reminded us of our problems. So let's be careful with saying we don't need to be fiscally prudent, we don't need to worry about NPAs, and let's just spend our way out of this problem. I don't think India has that luxury, but I'd love to understand if people think we do. I mean, we are at 14% of GDP as fiscal deficit.
Dr. Cha, do you believe that's the way to approach this, to keep an eye on what kind of spending it may involve, or do you believe that addressing the job situation is priority? And just to repeat my question to you as well, who does the onus of creating some kind of employment opportunities fall on? Equally, because, so often you've heard the point saying that India doesn't have enough jobs. It needs more people to be self-employed, which is why the Mudra scheme came about. Are we stuck between a rock and a hard place where we don't know how to resolve this one?
I do think I think fiscal prudence definitely important, but on the name of fiscal prudence, not taking responsibility for the people at large, and especially like half the population, is being completely irresponsible. So fiscal prudence cannot be the only of and not in even normal times, actually. Fiscal prudence is important, but what are you doing for that? There are it's a simple, if even if you're running a household, that you have to have some kind of prudence. Your debt ratio, you will not let it go. So that's understandable. But how do you do that? Fiscal prudence at what cost and through what measures? That is what it determines. That how do you spend? So I said it earlier also, and I'll be repeating it again, that where do you spend your money? What do you achieve through that? And following the normal principles, what is it that is going to, and it's both short, medium, and long runs. So you don't plan only for 1 year's budget. So you always plan for a long run, but you also plan for a short run. And therefore, fiscal prudence only through expenditure cut is actually not a wise policy at all, even in normal times. So I'm not talking of this year alone. I would say how you spend, where you see the largest potential for push to the economy alongside employment, alongside greater equality. So if you are, pushing, if your money is going towards both growth and equality, that is much better than money going towards growth only. And that is also not happening. It's not that we are a fast growing economy anymore. And it's not the COVID. So, and even when you are talking of already existing, ailments that the economy had, it's important that we don't talk only of so-called hardcore economic. Yes, gender divide is not something that COVID has brought in, but women are suffering actually much more. Urban, rural, even now, if you're looking at unemployment figures that CMI is releasing, the rural and unemployment rates are much higher than urban. So what has happened that people even working in urban areas have now gone to rural and they are being reported as rural. So all the earlier concepts of disguised employment and everything, I think one has to go back to and understand those much better. So I think it's important. Fiscal prudence is important, but how do you actually arrive at that prudence? What are your policies, what are your choices are equally important.
I do want to talk about youth and gender as specific pockets, but I think you've teed up my next question really well, Dr. Jha, which is to Rosa. Rosa, I want to talk a little bit about the rural context of what's been happening, because for a long time, that was the catch-all phrase, the fact that rural India was, saving us, protecting us, holding us up. And really, the underlining over there is the Narega program. But if you scratch deeper and you look at what's happening in terms of, the rural non-farm sector, it's not very vibrant. Even if you look at the data in terms of Narega, the number of applicants versus those who actually got some work saw a big gap, as did the fact that many of them had already completed their 100 days of work. Draw out for us the picture in terms of how you see it on what's happening with rural India and what you think the pressure points are that will have to be addressed in terms of employment.
Right. So yeah, I think what we saw at the very, during the lockdown time was urban India doing better or doing worse off than rural India. And what was happening in rural India was really agriculture acting as a cushion. And a lot of people, then becoming self-employed subsistence farmers in rural India. But then as we proceed into August, we find that this kind of differential between urban and rural kind of narrowing, and we don't see that rural is any better off. What we see again with CMI data, but also corroborated by other data, is huge loss of incomes for farmers, as well as the non-agricultural self-employed. So what we saw is, you have teachers, you have peons, other daily wage workers moving into subsistence farming, but also then facing huge income losses. So what this really calls for is expansion of what Narega, as you said, was a huge safety net. So up until the time when economy it can be revived, Narega, there has been calls for increasing the number of days under Narega, increasing the wage given under Narega, and then again also at the urban level, also having some kind of an urban employment guarantee, which could also then support urban workers as well. So there is this need. I mean, and I just want to go back to this point of, this is an exceptional situation. And these are kind of playing on existing fault lines that were there. But do we temporarily suture these fault lines, or do we want to actually concretely address these gaps? And that's what we should be aiming at, not sort of temporarily fixing these fault lines. I agree that there are fault lines that have inherently been there. It's exacerbated during this crisis. Let's address that through these kind of support systems, social security benefits, which should exist not just outside, not just within the employment framework, but outside of the framework of employment as well. As citizens, individuals should be eligible for some kind of support and benefits from the state as citizens, whether it's in big public services like health or education. And these are also employment generating programs as such, which could also further have multiplier effects like Professor
There
Jha
has
was
been some
talking
reference
about.
to what states can do in this context, Rosa, and I just wanted to, draw your thoughts on that in terms of what you're seeing in terms of trends, particularly in North India, where it seems like the unemployment situation was far more intense. We did have an announcement a couple of months back from the Uttar Pradesh government saying that they're going to provide at least 50 lakh youths with jobs till March 2021. Now, till Feb 2020, UP had about 34 lakh unemployed people. There was a huge scale reverse migration that happened, of course, during COVID. Do these figures seem likely? Do they seem doable for large states that are addled with an unemployment situation?
Do they seem doable? I'm not sure. What is it? Is it again going back to the fiscal constraints? Again, I would echo Professor Jha saying that I think so. The fiscal deficits and the fiscal challenges is going to be globally faced by countries across. It's not going to be unique to India. And I think beyond the point, we need to look beyond that and also address the moral responsibility of the state to take into account these kind of struggles, and it's real issues of people not being able to eat and hunger of households. So can states meet these kind of demands? So even amongst like there are instances of Jharkhand and UP and Kerala also having some kind of employment guarantee programs. They've announced increase in the wages for employment guarantee. They are constrained again because of their resources. It remains to be seen to what
No, my
extent they
question was
can
more
address
about
it.
whether or not this looks like it's going to happen, frankly, because Dr. Jha, if you look at what's happened in terms of government jobs, I mean, from 2005 to 2012, there's actually been a very, very small increase, just about 0.4 million per annum. When the state governments make these kinds of, promises, does it look like they can live up to them, simply put?
Yeah, I also think, for some reason, in last, say, at least definitely one decade, fiscal prudence has become, and the newer, if you ask public finance economists 2 decades ago, this whole space of fiscal space, even the terminology has changed. So this terminology of fiscal space is a new terminology that has come in, and we have forgotten about deficit financing. If you look at how recession was addressed earlier, the deficit financing was a huge tool that the state had, and we have completely forgotten about it. And I think it's time to go back to that. And yes, I'm not sure, but I also think different state governments are responding differently. So it would not be correct to think that all state governments actually respond in the same manner. So I do feel that state governments are acting very differently. They're also in a different position. So one inequality that is going to, and that I think has already again worsened, in addition to, say, gender, caste, and rural, urban, locational, is also interstate. I think that is again going to become much worse, and states where economies were already suffering are going to suffer more, and states which were in a better position are going to actually recover faster. So that's something we are going to see. So I am not sure like which state government we talk about, but I think union government has a role. Union government spending is much less, as pointed out, true, but union government works as a very critical element of what is it that is important. So in terms of signaling, and signaling is very, very important in governments and also for corporates. So what are you signaling is very important. And I would also like to add to one very common quote about leaky pipes, if you allow me to go ahead. What we found in our research across 4-5 states, and even other researchers that are coming in education, that even at its worst, public schooling system was doing something which was very significant for children going there, for both boys and girls. Now what we found that they are, it's a serious issue. We did a survey and we found that 80% of our children, more than 3,000 children we surveyed across 5 states, said that life was better before COVID. And the reasons are that we could meet our peer, we could learn a little, and girls, that we could also go out. Now, these are also important things. We keep talking, we keep, all the time we keep referring to this demographic dividend. There are individuals there, there are human beings there, demographic dividend. It's their lives, it's their future that we are talking about. They are the ones who would, earn and take the country ahead, and they are the ones who are really suffering. So let's not forget, even by every standard, I would say, yes, there are issues with public education, but if you actually start spending there, if you start even if you're signaling that public education is important, things will turn around. Look what happened in Delhi. Delhi government didn't do everything right. They have done certain things very, very, very questionable in education. Yet they have brought public education on the map of middle class. And that is what you need. So it's not, leaky pipes are there even in private sector. So let's not, brush everything using the same, color. There are, these are diverse in different states. So let's not assume that it's leaky pipes everywhere, even going by, simple indicators.
Not just our workforce, our future workforce as well. No, I take your point, and it's an important one. Ashutosh, another thing from, going from the point that Dr. Jha was making, which is that for many of the youth, aspirational jobs were actually in the services sector, hospitality, tourism, hotel, food and beverages. And that's really where the rug was sort of pulled off the feet of many restaurant owners. The entire tourism sector, frankly, is really in the doldrums going into 2021. What did you observe on that front? Because while I take your point about, digi learning and skilling, those were actual tangible jobs in extremely strong verticals, which now look quite shaky. Have you at LinkedIn had opportunity to collate that kind of data to see what's happening across those trends for tourism, hospitality industries?
So I think these industries definitely in short term will have a lot of pain, and their recovery will be much more longer. I think one thing we saw in our data, which is encouraging, is that a lot of professionals are ready to pivot and learn new skills so that they can reduce the short term pain and pivot into new industries. Now, it's difficult. I understand this is it takes a lot of will and a lot of learning new skills, but professionals are ready for it. And maybe if I do a loose correlation, that's where we are seeing increased number of hours on online learning because people are trying to learn new skills. So I think 62% of the professionals came and said that they're gonna pivot. They're open to pivoting their career to new industries, new geographies, doing something really, really different, and they're open to it, right? So I think that's what we are seeing in the workforce. And I think to your exact question, I think these particular verticals or industries will have more pain going forward. I mean, there are so many dimensions which will come into play: the vaccination, and when the vaccination is done across, when people feel safe and comfortable to travel, and tourism is back. So I think repivoting or pivoting their careers to new skills and reskilling is going to be very, very important. Like picking up your show's tagline, reskilling is the road to recovery. You have to learn new skills, you have to pivot to new skills, you have to find new jobs and use your skills to get there.
Mr. Sabharwal, gender is often made, a sideshow in these sort of conversations, but it's 50% of our workforce. Clearly, the brunt of this unemployment situation or the loss of jobs has been borne by the women. Equally, though, they are the ones who really come forth and worked in core sectors. I mean, I was just talking about, travel and tourism, which is in majority represented by women, but also the frontline women health workers, 1 million accredited social health activists, the Anganwadi workers, the auxiliary nurses. Would you expect to see something specific to bringing or attempting to bring women back into the workforce, considering the cavernous fall they've seen this year?
Well, they're not 50% of the workforce. I wish they were. They're only 20% of the workforce. So I think that is a really important point. I don't have an understanding. I think that a Ministry of Women Employment would be the same thing as a Ministry of Dalit Employment or a women or a Ministry of Rural Employment. I may be. Everybody is a child of their experience. My experience, we've hired about 18 lakh people in the last 15 years. I mean, we've hired somebody every 5 minutes for 15 years, but we've only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. So I would submit my lens is more horizontal. Maybe Rosa and they can, give specific stuff for gender. I think that governments don't create jobs. Government creates fertile habitats for spontaneous combustion. I think that India is a hostile place for small entrepreneurs. We have, a lot of us, I think, the moral argument, welfare states, Norway, Sweden, Finland are the highest as a percentage of GDP spending for the government, but they're also 3, 4, 5 in ease of doing business. Indian regulatory cholesterol is 67,000 compliances for employers, 6,700 filings, and it changed 6,000 times last year. As a large company, I have 150 guys in regulatory affairs who take care of that regulatory cholesterol. Small employers can't do that. So I think we should move to what we can do, right? I mean, I think that, if we're going to say that there's always two people in the world. Public debt this year will be 90% of GDP. Since 1991, it's been 70%. Fiscal deficit will be 14% of GDP. So it's not like a fiscal stimulus has not been given. 14% GDP, at least I think from a central bank perspective, is really at the limits of what we can possibly handle as a country. So I would be careful with saying that let's just, go for broke here. So I think that in my mind, non-fiscal things, lots of things can be done. We can reduce the regulatory cholesterol. I think we could make employee provident fund voluntary. I think we could force ESI. India's largest health insurance program has been missing in COVID. It has sitting on reserves of 70,000 crores. So we can fix the governance here. We can move to labor code. So I would just submit that this budget is largely going to be directional. If you think it's not going to be fiscally directional, because almost 75% of the budget is already spoken for today. So yes, if you want to speak about expenditure reform, we can do that. That's a political hot potato. But the budget exercise is about 25%. So there's a lot of non-fiscal stuff, whether ease of doing business, whether thinking about improving current social security programs, whether moving from 4 labor codes to 1 labor code. I know we've just moved to one, or cutting compliance. I think that, philosophers can describe the world in thousands of ways. The point, however, is to change it. And in a year, we do have an opening balance. We should have been outraged for the last 20 years about our fiscal situation or where our fiscal money was being spent. I think there has been, and I think it's changing. But in this year, we're not going to find another 5 lakh crores. And even if we do, that's already costs. There's a scissors effect in the budget. If you look at it, our revenues are down and our costs are up because of COVID. So if we want to have a discussion on what the budget can do, it won't be independent of the opening balance of the budget.
Sure. We will get to the solution side, but first we need to have a clear enough handle of how big the problem is. Rosa, let me ask you to add to the point I was making about gender on how acute the problem is first and how it can be addressed. Because, self-help groups, for example, have done exemplary work in terms of helping women both in the rural structure and in many urban communities as well.
Right. So again, just to come back to the numbers in gender, we see women just exiting. An already depleted women workforce, according to the PLFS, just about 2 in 10 of women in working age are actually participating in paid work. And out of that, you see about 50% who were there in December not coming back into work. Multiple reasons. You have childcare responsibilities, you have mobility restrictions, you have even harassment faced when they do go into work because of post-lockdown. There were all these restrictions. So what then this calls upon is, again, let's look at the sort of employment. Where are women mostly employed? They're employed in education, they're employed in the health sectors, and both of these are sectors that have seen huge impacts in terms of employment loss. But again, sectors that the government is typically underspent on. Only 1% of GDP is dedicated for health, 2% towards education. Now, both of these, this is something that has been talked about even before this, that we must increase spending on health and education. But again, this becomes all the more imperative here for many reasons. One, this is creating employment for women. This is creating the infrastructure for women to go out to work. So if you support Anganwadis, if you create childcare facilities, if you have extended educational facilities, women who are otherwise burdened with these responsibilities now can go out into paid employment. You also have, what is happening now is a large number of women and children being left behind because of the nutritional deficits that COVID has created, the educational deficits, which are always acting more at the lower rungs. You have women and children from lower rung households who are more likely to suffer these deficits. So all the more imperative to expand these services and again create employment where employment will actually be bringing women back into the workforce. And again, multiplier effects because of this employment generation. So there are ways in which, and this is something, again, go back to what Professor Jha said, putting these kind of, these are signals that the center can give in the budget, which will then feed back into state policies as well.
Dr. Jha, the one point that's been echoed quite a few times, especially going into the union budget, is talk of considering some kind of an urban employment scheme. A, what kind of cost do you think that would entail, and B, how do you think it could be structured? For example, the government has said they're considering a 50% increase in terms of infrastructure cost going into budget 2021. Do you think that in itself could be layered to provide more jobs, and do you think that should be a central point of attacking any jobs crisis, thinking about some kind of urban jobs guarantee scheme?
I think it does make sense to have urban job guarantee, and Narega has proven that this kind of scheme actually can be a lifeline, and I'm repeating this point that it's lifeline not only for those who are getting those wages, but also for the economy, because they are also spending. So and they are not saving a single bit of it, and therefore the economy is also surviving because of those spending, and therefore urban job guarantee scheme makes sense. And I do feel that when you are talking of reforms, whenever we talk of reforms, why do we talk of reforms in a manner that becomes against social security? We can actually talk of reforms. If you look at a lot of research actually around our private investment, it's not because of the labor laws that people have not spent. Ease of doing business is also about the governance at other end, that the license, that you have to get 12 licenses. Those are more important features than labor reforms, and labor reforms have to be also seen from the angle of social security and greater social security. All the state governments are sitting on or were sitting on, some of that has been spent now during COVID, on huge cess amount that they had collected on construction, and the living condition of those working in construction was pitiable. I mean, it's shocking the way they were living, and I talk about this with first-hand experience. So reforms, yes, we do need reforms, but what kind of reforms? Why is it that we think of reforms which are only about labor, and that actually goes against employment, and that therefore also goes against economy? So with a high population country, it's important. So what Rosa is talking about, it's when you create employment for a section of society which is completely largely out of the employment arena, and can push the growth if you bring them in. So I do think urban employment makes sense, labor reforms make sense, but not to make the employment security less secure, but to make it more secure. And that doesn't mean that you have to go back to what existed earlier. Reforms are important at all levels, and if again we go back to European countries, ease of doing business also comes from these governance reforms. So I think urban employment makes sense, governance reforms make sense, but we have to think differently. We have to think of people who have been living precariously, who can be a big, even if I drop the social aspects of it, they can be huge economic assets if we make wise investment choices, public investment choices, that also pushes right kind of private investment choices. So urban employment guarantee scheme definitely makes sense for the economy and for the people both.
Mr. Sabharwal, where do you see where solutions might lie? I mean, as we stepped out of the previous budget, the allocation to Narega was about 61,500 crores. It was actually lower than what had been allocated the year before that. That's probably been overshot. Are you in support of something like an urban employment scheme, an urban employment guarantee, or do you think other existing funds should be given greater inflows? What does the solution list look like to you?
I don't think Narega is an employment solution. It's a poverty solution, which is very important. I think that we can think about poverty differently from if you want to create jobs, if you think that the government is, or the fiscal deficit, or will create jobs. That's just not my view of the world. I think that a modern state is a welfare state. It should help people in poverty. It does have to figure out how to pay for it. I don't think welfare states are built on borrowing money or deficit financing. So my submission would be is that in a budget like this, I think most of the money will go to healthcare and, the vaccination program, and if we can, we should allocate more to education and healthcare. I don't think anybody disputes that. But I do think that we also have a responsibility for figuring out, find the money is not a solution. It's just my case to you. I mean, if the money could be found, the Indian welfare state doesn't lack ambition, it just lacks resources. So my submission to you is that everybody's looking for money. There is a shortage of it. So structural reform, continuing with making India a better place, an easier place to do business for small entrepreneurs. I make the point again, as large companies, I can have 150 guys in regulatory affairs who handle the cholesterol, and I go on my way doing my life. But for a small guy, these 67,000 compliances, 6,700 licenses, which changed 4,000 times last year. And by the way, 18,000 of them prescribe jail. Right? One of my favorite lines in the Vishnu Sahasranam is, why did God create fear? Because he could take it away. Right? Why do you have 24,000 ways entrepreneurs can go to jail? So I would submit that this budget is not going to be able to do much fiscally, but it could do a lot non-fiscally by fixing social security, by fixing ESI, by thinking about online education. Only 7 out of India's 1,000 universities are licensed for online education. 200 foreign universities operate in India. That makes no sense. I think deregulating skill universities. I can think of a number of non-fiscal interventions which would give entrepreneurs freedom to pursue their ambitions. Today, the regulatory cholesterol either keeps most Indian companies small. We have a dwarf problem. Any entrepreneur can create a baby and a dwarf. Both are small, but the baby is going to grow. We need more babies rather than dwarfs. So my view of the world is that this budget will obviously allocate money to healthcare and education, and I hope someday we allocate much more. But find the money is not a solution, and there's not much money. So let's hope the budget clears the regulatory cholesterol. It wasn't God's will that it should take 71 years for India to cross the GDP of UK, which we did this year. And we've tried all fiscal and deficit financing. The biggest tax for is inflation. Right now, we have a macroeconomic gift because of low oil prices. But let's just try and make sure we keep inflation between 4 and 6 also.
But you're saying in terms of specific solutions, you wouldn't expect to hear something concrete on jobs. You would expect to hear something on health and vaccination, perhaps a little bit on education. And given the ancillary support the government can extend, the job situation should resolve itself.
No, the structural reform is the biggest gift you give to job creation. I just don't view spending money as a way to create jobs. I view spending money as a way to help poverty. Those are two different vectors. I have no problem with, I think that an Indian welfare state should have more resources so it can do more, but it doesn't.
Ashutosh, you as well have pointed out that you think skilling is a very important way to go. What would you want to hear in terms of a thrust towards skilling in this budget?
Yeah, a scale solution which can help us scale millions. And by the way, all our data is white-collared professionals. So I think I want everybody to factor that into my answer. But I think any scaled initiative which can help people quickly skill, reskill, and pivot their careers is going to be the most important thing. So for example, how we can help people learn some of the digital skills, which we see in our data that next few years is going to be a lot of digital demand. So how can we help the professionals quickly ramp up on their digital skills? And from a digital perspective, again, I think they're helping build infrastructure, right? So education, even the SMEs, helping them quickly ramp up on digital infrastructure is going to be very, very important for the future, right? So those are the couple of things which come to mind, like building a skilling infrastructure and then helping build a digital infrastructure, both on the education side and even on the SMEs side. That's going to be helpful.
Rosa, the same question to you, solutions, and if you could break that up really into what you would like to see both in the rural and urban context, but because I think we haven't talked enough about the rural situation and how that can be addressed from a solutions point of view.
Okay, just so I think both in the rural and urban context, this is something that we spoke about earlier as well, which is basically ensuring universal, government provision of universal basic services, which is education and health. And I think this is employment generating. It also has multiplier effect. It also has sort of cascading, beneficial effects for the population at large. So that would go for both urban and rural. In rural, we clearly would like to see an amp up for the funding for Narega. It is a social security benefit system. It is a fallback option for many, which is all the more imperative now, given what we see in terms of just income loss and hunger and consumption declines. In the urban, we would also expect, it would be good in some way to at least have a pilot of an urban employment guarantee, if not going all the way, to see how this works out. It also again has multiplier effects, creating the infrastructure for, again, private firm expansion and also stimulating aggregate demand. What we also saw that, that it was in the, again, CMI numbers, but I think this would be corroborated by other numbers as well, is that you have public sector employment being the least sticky. There's very few people lost employment in public sector employment. So you have, this is a fact that has been around. There have been huge vacancies in government sector jobs. There's about 2 million jobs just in Anganwadi workers, which just in the health sector, which needs to be filled up. So again, filling up these work vacancies, hiring more people in the public sector is also something that could regenerate jobs in rural and urban areas.
Dr. Jha, final word with you on this very, very lively debate around jobs. Should one obsess about what kind of numbers and figures are put forth, or whether a scheme is or isn't, or should one look at direction and intent of the government on other tracks such as health and education, and all that sinks in at some point to what we're doing to create a better job environment or ecosystem? Oops, I think we've lost the connection with Dr. Jha. Let's see if we can get her back, because we've still got just a couple of minutes to go. But Rosa, let me pose that same question to you. What if we don't hear anything in terms of a specific scheme, but we hear more about intent in other directions? I think we've got Dr. Jha back. Let me do a quick check. Dr. Jha, is my voice reaching you? Yeah, I don't know if you've got my question.
Yes.
But
yeah. So
I was asking you whether people who are watching the economy should obsess about figures this time round, and whether or not the budget lays out something specifically for jobs, or whether the focus should be that some of the other core pillars like health and education are addressed, and all that then sinks into a better ecosystem for jobs generally.
That's what I think. So I'm in complete agreement with Rosa that if you actually take these together, health, education, social security, and look at both short term and long run. So it's not that it's not money going down the drain. Actually, in the short run itself, you will see the impact on the economy. So I think it's important to see the interconnections and then look at it, even in terms of when you are estimating and predicting, you should see the interconnections. So health, education, and direct employment. It's not about, when it's social security, I would actually refrain from saying it's poverty. I will say creating social security in a manner that it also enables demand for private goods, and that would help. So I do think that working on all of these together, including rural and urban employment, keeping that in mind, that your money should go where the employment potential is higher rather than only growth potential, is very critical. And if that happens, you would see, certain state governments are thinking on those lines, and I do feel you will see the results soon.
Lots to mull about as the finance minister structures her budget speech. Thank you, all of you. It's been fascinating to see this argument from so many different facets and points of view. Of course, the next time we join you, we will have stepped into a new year. So I hope it's a restful break for everyone. And thank you very much to all my panelists for joining in on this discussion today. From the team here, goodbye. We'll see you again next Monday, of course, in 2021.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.